it's really hard to tell how in the 21st century, with everyone connected but disconnected at the same time, how you actually get that done.
And we're running late on time, so we should make sure and keep on to the next people on stack. We have 8 on stack. Hopefully we'll get to this question with the other questions too. Number 3.
So I have a 2-part question right here. First, I was kind of wondering what your definition of nonviolence is and militant nonviolence. And then also my question is, how does personal self-defense or self-defense as a community fit into the practice of nonviolence?
Well, nonviolence means that whatever your advantage in numbers, you do not physically harm those who are responsible for your oppression. You stop them by other means. For example, you don't cooperate with what they want to do, and you force them to resign. So you want to build up a big movement, and there's a lot of thinking that goes into this. I would just say that, by the way, as all the revolutions have shown, just because you kill a lot of people doesn't mean that when you get into power, you actually cure a lot of the things that you wanted to. So I think the first thing to notice about it is, in the civil rights movement, through things like boycotts, including the school protests in Birmingham, very major changes were made. Now, there are a lot of other conditions, and there are people who sought violent change, and it's not simple to talk about. But if you think of those examples, some of Rochan's skepticism may diminish a little bit. As far as Oakland went, as far as I could see, some thousands of people were involved in confronting the police. It wasn't a lack of courage. So, what did they want to do? It wasn't that they weren't willing to do it. It wasn't a large number of them weren't willing to do it. How organized were they? I don't know. But they were somewhat organized. Some people were organized. But what did they have in mind to do when they got organized and they got a lot of people out there? Because Occupy has had a lot of people, and the fact that you're under a lot of attack and silence in the mainstream media does not mean that your time will not come again. If Obama is elected and cuts Social Security, there are going to be a lot of folks who are going to be out in the streets. And if Romney is elected, if people aren't so demoralized that they're hiding under stones, probably there'll be occasion.
What about self-defense?
Where does self-defense fit in then to a nonviolent movement?
Self-defense as an individual matter, it seems to me, is fine. Somebody tries to hurt you, stop them. And if you kill them, that's part of self-defense. It's good to have the nonviolence of the strong, that is, as Gandhi said, but probably people who are capable of defending themselves are capable of figuring out how to fight back in a reasonable way. If you know how to deal with situations, probably you'll be better at it than somebody who has good visions for situations. Having said that, when you are attacked by the police, you have to figure out how to stop them or how to retreat without killing them. So the aim is not, we get a large number of us as in guerrilla war, and a small number of them will kill them. Right? That's the classic tactic of guerrilla war. It's a good tactic, sometimes. It's been a long time since it's been very successful. I would just say they have a lot of firepower, and what is strongest about nonviolence is that, in the words of the Downing Street memo, wrong foots them. That is to say, they attack a march of people who are making perfectly reasonable demands, which is not out to kill them, which is not heavily armed, which is not going to do funny things to passersby. And so, as every ruler has discovered, and Israel is now discovering Israel knows only violence. And the boycott and divest movement has them on their heels.
Okay, number 4.
That would be me. I'm going to skip my question. I just wanted to use the opportunity to amplify something that Alan just said. I just want to make 3 quick points because I think they're very important points, and they're present in what Alan's already said. One is that I think we need to remember that Occupy isn't quite a year old yet, and that a lot of the struggles that we've been talking about, or Alan's been talking about tonight, are long-term struggles. So we're just at the beginning. So we have to keep that in mind, and patience is, in my experience, one of the most important virtues of a social justice activist. The second point is there's a difference in Occupy from other social movements, or at least other very large ones, at least the ones we've been talking about, is that we're radically democratic and horizontal. That means that the politics are quite messy, but virtuous, right? They're the kind of politics we want, but we don't have the kind of response time or the kind of unification in tactics and strategy that other movements which are top-down might have. Which brings me to the third point, which is in order to gain more unity, we need more education, we need more dialogue, we need more congregating of people to discuss these things and come to agreement about them. And so that's, I just wanted to then bring it back to this moment here. That's what we're doing now tonight, is to talk about the pros and cons of these kinds of strategies, because in the long term, we want to bring people into a unified kind of commitment to long-term strategy. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Thanks.
Number 5. That's you, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to address briefly perhaps what our goals are, because I think that there are some of us who definitely have a political revolution in mind, and there are some of us who have more of the idea of a social revolution, in the sense of not necessarily overthrowing the state, but dismantling it and dismantling the capitalist system. So oftentimes in a horizontal-oriented movement like Occupy or Indignados, the goal is not to take power from those who have power, but rather to dismantle the power structures of the hierarchy and so forth. And this is happening in Spain. You can watch every day the power of the Indignados movement that is very community-oriented, very decentralized, and it is very organized within the community. But Spain has a history of this going back before the Spanish Civil War. So how do we begin to build that? And I think that the violence and nonviolence thing then becomes a side piece of what our long-term objectives are. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X had an enormous amount of things to contribute to how you make resistance. So I was just going to throw that out there. I'm definitely coming more from an autonomous anarchist perspective on this. Yeah.
Well, I would say amen to Chad. And to you, this is a really good point. And the same kinds of discussions are useful about transforming the society. So you have to have enough of a movement, and you have to have a tactical impetus. For example, the banks have now gotten into debt slavery for students. And I talk to students who go to DU and get master's degrees in international studies who are 100 to 125 grand in debt. And it makes me want to cry. No, I am teaching at a silly place, and these are friends of mine, so it makes me want to cry. And yes, I hear that you want to cry. So the first thing I would say about it is probably a nationwide campaign to get the banks out of the business of student debt, and to get the government to restore paying for education, democratic education for everyone, and having militant sit-ins at the banks and in every university targeted would be a very good way. And by the way, SDS used to do things like that. It's not that hard to figure out. It's not real confusing, Roshan. And so one of the things about having campaigns is pick burning issues and do that. Now, if you do that, a lot of people are going to say, but these banks, you know, they bought the U.S. Army, the U.S. military. They got General Petraeus, right? But the whole thing is privatized. They're going to fight if they get paid an extra $1 an hour. And you're going to order them, but they're going to turn their guns around, right? I mean, the head of Blackwater's out because he murdered somebody who was critical of him, and one of his assistants was going to talk about it. I think he's still supposed to talk about it, though they're hushing it up. He's now living in Qatar. That's Mr. Prince, the Christian. So it's there. Then you can have a really deep discussion about how we're going to have the society be like Occupy, and have discussions like this as opposed to from the top down. And I can see how we all learn something from it, and there are lots of things to do, so we can all keep busy, and it's like something interesting, right? But if you got a movement, then it's really interesting because you're introducing a lot of people, and it's not five of us. I used to have meetings sometimes with revolutionaries of another sort, and there would be five of us and three of them and one person who might want to do something. And their particular angle was there were 27 points of their program, including what you thought of China in 1927, which you all had to agree to before you could do anything. So we actually sometimes the people left and discussed, but once in a while, some people stayed with us because they figured that we might be nuts, but at least we wanted to do something.
Okay, we only have about 10 minutes left, and we have 5 more on stack, so the last few people on stack might not be able to get gotten to it, I'm sorry. But we'll go to number 6.
Gandhi and King both had very specific goals. Gandhi, independence from Britain; King, the end of Jim Crow. And once King actually started broadening and trying to address broader social issues, his movement became less successful, less effective. Can you have a successful nonviolent movement when you're trying to achieve broader, more diffuse goals of social justice rather than specific individual goals?
Well, I would suggest reading Deming on this, but just about this important question. There is no broader goal than having an integrated society in the country of slavery and segregation. And anybody who thinks that King was just a civil rights leader and that was a narrow thing that they did in the South and the rest of us is misreading it. As for Gandhi, let's see, he wanted Hindu-Muslim unity and fought for it, and he fought to treat the outcasts as human beings. And a lot of what Gandhi was, that's part of it, what his message was. Now, he was also rather authoritarian, as far as I can see. And King was a little better on this. But as far as it goes, I see no reason why we can't take on issues of, for example, foreclosures along the student debt. I see no reason why we can't take on that bombing Iran is nuts. I see no reason why we have to spend this, if it gets cut back in the segregation thing, whatever separation thing, in the budget, the military expense will only not increase as much. Sequester, right? I'd say that we should cut out, just for starters, 1,000 of the 1,280 military bases. And we should re-employ soldiers to fix the roads and learn how to educate and think and be part of a normal society and not kill people. And we should spend money on healing up the people who are suffering from our wars and doing stuff about PTSD, and we should spend a lot of money on that. And I think we ought to put all these arms manufacturers pretty much out of business. And if we put them 95% out of business, we would still produce more arms than the next 10 biggest powers. So we have really important things to look at which will not withstand questions.
Number 7.
Kind of a comment, something I think is pretty simple and it was somewhat implied in some of the things you said, but I think it needs to be fleshed out. We live in a society where the ruling class use divisive politics to pit the lower classes against each other. The ruling class operate through divide and conquer, and they do so in part with actual or the threat of violence, whether it's domestically with our police, with our prison system, or if it's internationally with our just hyper-violent military in the world right now. So if we seek to transform this country, be it socially, politically, or both, be it on a broad issue or narrow ones, if we engage in violent action to do so, we will have fundamentally failed to transform what it is that we're working against. And I think that that's kind of the power of what Gandhi and King had started to figure out, is that you cannot create lasting change through violence, because at the end of the day, your new leaders will be murderers as well.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to what you said about divide and rule, but I think it's pretty well a separate question. For Occupy, look, the most oppressed group in the society and the ones who are most against the Iraq war and bombing around and everything else are black. Young black people are enormously caught up in the prison system. We have 2.3 million prisoners, read the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, 25% of the world's prisoners. So movements start where they start. There were black people in Occupy and are black people in Occupy, but frankly, if you want to change the society, probably the movement is going to be predominantly black and Latin, or a lot black and Latin, and have to figure this out. How are you going to figure this out? Probably got to discuss it. So we've got to figure out some things we can do together, but I would think that slavery with an emphasis on fighting racism would be a help. Now, as for whether you then do it violently or non-violently, I think that's somewhat a separate question. So I'm with you on that non-violence is better, but I think that one should fully discuss the question, and I don't think the weaknesses of Occupy, I mean, you know, Chad's point, for Christ's sake, it changed the whole discussion in the country, right? There is nothing more important in the last 20 years done in the United States, including the election of Barack Obama, than that. I mean, it's pretty damn important. And it changed it throughout the world, because they're strangling Europe, these same bankers. Goldman Sachs and AIG are strangling Europe right now. Okay, but the group that came out to do it isn't everybody. And some black people came out, but you know, it's a lot tougher to be involved in the prison system. There's a lot of white people involved, poor whites involved in the prison system, probably people sitting in this room are. But it's complicated how you do this and how you get people involved. So I've worked on this with very limited success for many years. But I'll just say about it that there are lots of things to discuss about it. The issue you raised is a profound one. By the way, if you could circulate my thing, so anybody who would give me their email, I'll send them my democratic individuality bill. If anybody's interested. Next.
Okay, number 8.
You're right. A few things that's kind of adding to what Chad and some others have said. In terms of nonviolence and violence, what we've done, and over since we got started with Occupy Denver, there hasn't been a clear agreement yet about nonviolence, how to use it. I think a lot of the stuff that Chad just suggested in terms of how to do that, I think, is very important. I do not believe that it's necessarily religious to be nonviolent. Certainly not to be part of some formal religion. There is a difference, however, there's a number of different differences. Because over almost in the beginning, we started, some people were going into nonviolence, others were going into violence. And some were really into the spiritual or religious concepts as the basis for it, which is not, that's certainly a perfectly valid idea, but others are looking at, the way I look at it, and I tend to see a spiritual point as well, but my main look is what's practical. What will really work to make us change this world. I think that the nonviolence is what will really work. It's not just because I believe in some spiritual or religious notion, it's because I think, and I think other people feel the same way. It's because we believe that that's really the best way to do this and accomplish what we want.
Arab Spring was not made mainly by Muslims who did it because they were Muslim. The Muslim League wasn't very out there. There were lots of individuals who were out there, in Egypt, for example. The movements that brought down the East European authoritarian regimes were not terribly religious and were not terribly organized. They had guarded this. There were some religious people. They weren't terribly religious. I was in the early civil rights movement. I went on a freedom ride in Chestertown, Maryland. It was a group from Harvard, mainly white. I wasn't religious. I read a lot of poetry. I was distantly spiritual. I didn't do it because I was spiritual. I participated in the thing because I had the conviction that we were all equal and that the American South was a great horror in the way it was organized. I do not believe that, and I'll just speak of the anti-war movement once upon a time. Personally, I'm a little sad. I actually had a rather negative view of King at the time. I thought nonviolence wasn't any good, and I thought the rebellions in American cities, and the woman who said in Washington when they set it afire after King was killed, we're going to end this. She didn't mean nonviolent. Was probably right. I didn't meet too many people who were religious, and those who were religious weren't leaders of the movement for the most part. As far as I know, it was a big movement. We had a Harvard strike. We had strikes on hundreds of campuses, poor, not so poor, and so on and so forth. I think religion is an issue in nonviolence, but I think one of the things, and this is also true about Gandhi and worshiping him, you know, it's pretty useless to talk yourself out of doing something or thinking about something or trying to do something, saying it can't be done, because you have one view or another of people who did something once upon a time. The people who come out to Occupy when it has big demonstrations in Oakland and around the country come out for reasons right then, and some of them are religious, but a lot of them aren't. And the fact is that they're just like the human beings who participated before in all the movements which obeyed history. And yes, sometimes real conscience, and there are, you know, it's hard to believe around here, but you know, think of Martin Luther King, there are Christians of conscience in the United States. Right? I mean, if you think about what is called Christianity in the mainstream press, if that is the people who tacked Christ up on the cross, I'm mistaken. But I think they're on the wrong side. So one of the things about it is, Gandhi changed Hinduism dramatically. He didn't get rid of the caste system, he didn't get rid of patriarchy, but he did fight against bigotry toward the untouchables, children of God, and he did fight to unite Muslims and Hindus. It's very wrong to see what he did as standard Hinduism. And that's Perry Anderson notwithstanding this. He's sarcastic about it. He says, well, it combines a little Hinduism with Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky and seance. So he missed the boat. Marxist that he is. 9 and 10?
Okay, it's basically 7 o'clock, but we can take one last number 9. So,
okay,
go.
I'll be quick. Okay, so basically you define nonviolence as not physically, committing to no physical harm against your oppressors. Which, first of all, to me, doesn't make sense because, I mean, the definition makes sense, but practically it doesn't make sense as a strategy or a moral standard to me, because why would we want to be protective of Hitler or Heinrich Himmler or Bush or Obama when they're committing war crimes against innocent people on a mass scale?
And you might run that one by the room and try Hitler and Obama and see how far you get on Obama.
Right. Well, I know that
you won't find
comparison
that very good. Well, maybe
mocked a lot. But just as mass murderers, why should we be protective of mass murderers? Is something that comes to mind when I think of nonviolence. I think it's important that we, look at not all violence is the same. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but it tends to be put forward as fundamentally true that if you use violence against your oppressor, then you become the same as your oppressor. This is a common thread in nonviolent movements. And that also doesn't make sense because a rape victim who physically fights back against a rapist does not become a rapist. The Jews who fought back in the Warsaw Ghetto did not become Nazis or fascists themselves. So I think that's important. But we can look at nonviolence.
We just need to get a response because GA's going to start.
I'll finish this one up real quick. So we can look at pacifism as a strategy, a tactic, and a moral standard. And as a strategy, you're not allowing people to fight back. As a moral standard, you're blaming the victim for fighting back. So my question is, how does, a strategy of nonviolence function in a state of violence? And also, how does nonviolence as a strategy and as a moral standard, how does it not completely oppose a culture of resistance to oppression? You know, effective resistance, not symbolic resistance to oppression.
Well, the first point to note is that I praise John Brown. So as far as it goes, I think the American Civil War was a good thing. And I think that the abolitionist role in the American Civil War was a good thing. And I think the Reconstructionist governments were a good thing. And if they killed the fucking Ku Klux Klan and all of the powers that be, I would be for it. Okay, just so we understand each other. Okay? So if you want to argue with me, you're going to have to go a little further. Now, what I said was off the cuff, but let me put the point really sharply. I am for millions of people surrounding the White House and taking the power away from the elite. Okay? I am for everybody who works for military industry stopping cooperating. I am for all kinds of harassment and coercion short of physical harm, which stops all of the illegal and unconscionable and immoral institutions of this society from doing their horrors, and I mean the Supreme Court, the Senate, you name it, okay? So when I talk about nonviolence and mass militant nonviolent resistance, I mean it in the sense that you mean mass militant violent resistance. I think, however, that if you want to go out and kill a lot of people, you might be surprised at the people who turn out to be all right, and you might also be surprised at how isolated you become and how silly the resistance becomes. Because, you know, I used to argue with the weathermen in SDS, and I'm distantly related to Kathy Boudin. And as far as it goes, some of them were courageous. They went and they blew up some workers in a hall in Wisconsin. They blew up some of themselves. They had a few violent actions that blew up some real targets that weren't covered by the mainstream media. And their bomb maker was working for the FBI and wrote a book about it afterwards. So one of the things about it is they fancied themselves really something. And Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn have recently been in the news because they were friends where they did some campaign events with Obama. But the fact is that what they proposed as a way of dealing with the empire hated nearly everybody. Eldridge said, in one of his not-so-good moments, faced the quote, the 185 out of 200 million Americans who know good need to be blown up.
What about the NLF?
All right, so it's actually past 7, and we
I said that
will
they
talk
were a good
afterwards.
revolution.
And anybody's welcome to come and join in the democratic process of General Assembly down at Civic Center Park.
Great.
Yes.
And if anyone has questions about getting involved with Occupy Denver, we'll be down.